Welcome to the panel, What Evidence Do You Need to Take Action? The Role of Communication in Evidence-Informed Policy. It is well and good to have facts and evidence, but what's the use if nobody is listening? How we communicate information matters, and it is becoming increasingly complex. With sustainability and climate change as a lens, our panelists will discuss the tools and structures needed to make knowledge brokering more effective. These panelists are David Pedersen, Director of the Humanomics Research Center and Knowledge Broker for Algorithms, Data and Democracy at the Willem and Willux Foundations, Claire Craig, Provost of Queen's College at the University of Oxford and former Chief Science Policy Officer at the Royal Society, Lewis Collins, Editor-in-Chief of One Earth. Please welcome this session's moderator, Elisa Reis, Professor of Political Sociology at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to convene this section. I welcome the panelists that have just been introduced. Of course, we have a serious matter to discuss. Communication of science evidence is something that we are all concerned about. And just to offer a sort of a kickoff to our panelists, I would like to observe that we often assume, implicit or explicitly, that problems in translating scientific evidence into effective contribution to policy formulations are restricted to the flow of communication between science producers and policy formulators. But we also know that how the public perceives science-based evidence is part of the equation. Given that policymakers need to assure public support to their initiatives, and also given that society is the end of any policy, how science-based evidence is conveyed to the public at large deserves careful attention. What could be done in this respect to improve communication between the scientific community and the public? I hope each one of you will give me some insights into that question. Thank you very much. Claire, would you like to start?
Thank you very much, Elisa. I think my very initial starting point would be that it's absolutely not, whatever the it is, it's not a one-way process. What I don't think any of us are likely to talk about is, as it were, a bunch of science over here, and the challenge is simply how it gets described to a large kind of blob of public over there. That deficit model is I hope, well and gone. So then we're into some really interesting questions about how to engage with different types of publics and different types of audience in the whole system in which you are creating knowledge that might be relevant to the policy matter that you're concerned about, whether it's climate change or the pandemic, and about engaging throughout the process, both of what are the questions you really want to ask and answer, and then also how do you ensure that people can use the information that's being created. I worked for a while with at the Royal Society in the UK, also with the Academy of Medical Sciences, on evidence synthesis, which I think is part of this whole kind of system and pattern. So how do you bring academics particularly together, scientists and other researchers, to create knowledge that is more than just one single report, one single piece of news, that actually is drawing together on a whole field and across the fields. In that work, we thought there were four things that really mattered. The starting point was inclusivity, actually working with the people who are going to use your knowledge to work out what they want to know. And it might be that the experts want to tell the decision makers or the public things that the decision makers or public, didn't think they wanted to know, but also you need to know what's in their minds. A classic for me would be at the Royal Society at one point providing advice on genetically modified crops. We included a Q&A on whether there are genes in food. And that wasn't a question the scientists thought they needed to answer, but it was one that by engagement we knew we needed to. And then the other three elements are kind of rigor, accessibility and transparency, because if you are engaging with publics or even engaging with decision makers when you're creating advice, you've also got to be stronger and clearer about what the forms of knowledge are that you are creating, because I'm sure that as you scratch the surface of any scientist or indeed any scholar, then it matters to them that what they say is rigorous. So it's not a question of letting your rigor go as you engage with the publics, but it is a question of being more open and perhaps humble about how you frame the problem and about how you work with people to get your knowledge in. Sorry, that was perhaps rather a long preamble, but I hope it kicks us off.
Yes, it's very interesting that you offer such an integrative view that I'm very grateful to hear about. And perhaps David and Collins want to add something to the same question.
Yes, thank you, Elisa. Yeah, I also very much believe in the same understanding as Claire just mentioned of how to communicate research to policymakers and society at large. We really, in a profound way, have to leave behind the deficit model and also the linear model of knowledge transfer. These processes, when talking to policymakers, media institutions, professional societies, and also citizens and NGOs are very much not linear processes. They are multi-directional, often involving several iterations and several different target groups and stakeholder groups. So it's important that we acknowledge that, that I think from the outset that science is only one part of a larger picture, and it's about understanding what type of part that is. We should acknowledge, as Claire also said, that it's important to provide systematic and methodologically sound knowledge as far as we can, but also that other opinions, values, even ideologies, and different worldviews also have a role to play in policy making. I also believe that when we then understand how to provide that contribution, we of course have at the same time to be humble, but also to be firm about the integrity and I guess also the authority of science. So that has a lot to do with being very open about the methodologies and the protocols that we are basing our advice on, and also understanding how advice again fits into a larger policy cycle. In terms of engaging the larger society, this can be very difficult, and it can be difficult for several different reasons. Sometimes simply policy making, including science-intensive policy making, are just under time constraints. There needs to be action and decisions made in a short hurry, often in a crisis or emergency situation, as the one the entire world has found itself in throughout the last 2 years. And here it can sometimes be a bit difficult to open up the entire advisory process and also the process of science to society. But nonetheless, I think this is what should be done, both in the short term, in the midterm, and in the long term, really upstream engagement and including citizens and other stakeholders as equal components of policymaking.
Okay, thank you. What are your ideas, Collins? Luis?
Yeah, I think the points raised so far are really important, and a third element that I think is really important to consider is we quite often talk about the scientists, or this scientists that the work comes from, and science historically and even now in many respects is very disciplinary. It's from one discipline, and a scientist from that discipline will be trained in that discipline in a quite linear, one-dimensional way. And when it comes to the application of their science, so after higher education and training, quite often the application of their knowledge is again very disciplinary and about one topic. The challenges that we're facing, particularly when the challenges that need policy to really guide our actions to resolve some of these issues, it's far from disciplinary. It's very multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. It requires different minds to come together to think about the more holistic, bigger picture. And science is very young in that respect. You know, the vast majority of science history has followed a single track. It's been about providing as much information as possible about a single, one person's expertise in one area, and hoping that that information together will provide us with the answer, with the solutions to address these challenges. And that's just not how the world works. So something that is happening now, but really needs more support and more engagement, is more interdisciplinary science, more co-creation of knowledge beyond academics. So engagement with non-academics has been, as has been alluded to so far, to really identify what is the problem, what information do we need in a local as well as a global context, which is very often overlooked. We often look at these big global problems and forget that there are local contexts, which is where the policy is actually enacted. What is the challenge? What information do we need? And what expertise do we need to come together to really identify, collect that information? Only through this more holistic approach will we be in a position to have effective science to policy translation. It's part of this bigger, very nonlinear process, as David pointed out. But that starting point, the science itself, still needs to be developed, and it still needs to evolve into a much more holistic approach.
Thank you. I think I'll start now, taking into account what has been said about the need for transdisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity. It seems to me that science has up to now betted essentially on specialization. And now, as if we are entering a second stage of scientific work, we all recognize that we have to transpass the boundaries, to work together so as to really tackle the problems in big challenges we face. But as maybe it's my political science bias, but it seems to me that evidence provided by humanities and social science are not really well contemplated when we discuss science communication. And we do know that dimensions such as human perceptions, cultural frames, regularities in human behavior are too important to be neglected by policy initiatives, as you themselves have just mentioned. But often expertise on these subjects are not incorporated into policy designs as if they were too uncertain. You think there are translation bugs that impair communication of knowledge the humanities and social science offer and the policy actors, and perhaps even other scientists? What narrative strategies could improve the flow of communication to provide for valid information to policy success? I know it's too broad, but any of you who would like to address that question are welcome, or perhaps the three of you if possible. Feel free to show us your own dynamics, Hugo.
I'll jump in then. So, I mean, the first thing is I don't think you could be more right. I think of Naomi Oreskes, the science historian's History from the Future, the Collapse of Western Civilization, which basically says that one of the contributory factors is the huge divide between the physical sciences and their framing of climate change in that case, and the humanities. We did a quick look at the, just to take one example, the 1.5 degree special report in 2018 of the IPCC had, depending on how you count them, about 270 authors, of whom less than 20 were social scientists, and none that you could see were humanities scholars. Now, there are reasons why the IPCC has focused so strongly on the physical sciences, and you know, those are in some ways good ones, but it's just an incredible kind of dominant framing now of the issue. So that's kind of, yes, I agree completely that this is an important question. I'm really interested to hear the views of the other panelists on this. There's a kind of there's quite a few. I mean, the more disciplines you bring into science advice, the more you have to engage across different methodologies, different languages, different models of the world. And I think that that doesn't make it less worth doing. It just means it gets increasingly difficult, at least until you've got the mechanisms established. And the classic for me, and it's just, I mean, would be when you've managed to get a humanities scholar in front of a government minister, and they say something like, well, to problematize the situation, you know, to problematize the situation. And it's like, you know, politicians know they've got problems, and it's not that they're looking for speciously simple answers, but that's a whole new, often bringing your humanities scholar into the science advisory circles for the first time, creates a whole nother learning of language and understanding of different ways. So we need to crack on and kind of and get used to that and work out how to do it better. And then finally, I just say that once you do start looking and working with humanities scholars in all sorts of advisory capacities, it's absolutely amazing and really helpful. I've just doing some work at the moment with a scholar of literary criticism, contemporary film and novels, and actually looking at the cognitive value of stories and the way that narrative models could complement and can complement, for example, quantitative modelling, because we do all hold narrative models in our head of different social and political and other situations, and yet computational models can be very charismatic. They're essential, but they're not sufficient for tackling the kind of issues that we need to look at.
I'll happily jump in here as well. And equally in this question, Elisa, I think it is important that we're developing some progressive answers and not only identifying the problems. Obviously, as Claire just said, there are some obstacles to the inclusion of humanities and social sciences. There has been a traditional hierarchy of disciplines in which we tend to believe that the physical sciences and natural and technical and health sciences are kind of the most profound, and that we cannot, as it were, trust the social sciences and humanities in quite the same way to come up with robust evidence and data, but that they are more, as has also been a common label, they are more to be understood as interpretive sciences. And in a world of policymaking, interpretation is what everyone can make. So in a way, I would say that the social sciences and humanities often are too close to policy in order to have real impact. And what I mean by that is that it is in the heart of these disciplines to problematize and to challenge normativities. Also the normativity, that is the values and norms and ideologies that lies at the heart of decision making. So when you invite somebody to Congress or in the ministry or within a government agency and you ask them to really challenge your rationality, it gets, close encounters. It gets to the bottom of what it means to make decisions and come up with solutions and scenarios. And for some policymakers, that can be a little bit uncomfortable, really, to be challenged on your basic worldview and your basic rationality. But I also believe this is exactly what we need to do. So just to give you one example, again, from Scandinavia, I'm from Denmark, and we have seen a very strong presence of behavioral science throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Very early on in the pandemic, it became evident to a lot of policymakers, but actually also journalists and I guess citizens at large, that a huge key to solving a problem like COVID lies within our behavior, in the way we understand compliance, in the way we are selecting information online, in the way we are ascribing or not trust to authorities. So all these questions very early on became critical for the government to understand in order to devise more effective communication strategies, also talk to more vulnerable groups and groups that would not normally listen to scientists. Now with the rollout of the vaccines, we have seen similar patterns. As was said early on in Denmark, the current crisis is as much a health crisis as a social and communication crisis. And we also saw that that no matter how effective and how solid the data behind the vaccines turned out to be, there was still a major job to be done in terms of convincing the public and building trust around public interventions in health. So again, here, I think it's utmost crucial that we include and engage the social sciences and humanities.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can only echo the comments from David and Claire. It's worrying how little the humanities and social sciences have been integrated into the larger body of science historically. At RELX last year, we put together an analytics report that broke down each of the Sustainable Development Goals and looked at the different subject areas that had contributed to the body of science that had been published over the last 5 years. And while some of the SDGs had a strong social science component, these weren't issues such as climate action or life below water or life on land. These were the partnerships, the justice, the education SDGs. When you look at these bigger integrated issues like biodiversity loss, like climate change, food insecurity, water scarcity, the contribution or the inclusion of the social science and humanities is very, very low. And this partly comes down to, as was indicated, this lack of acceptance almost that you can get robust, solid results from humanities and social sciences, which you obviously absolutely can. And I think for so long, science has looked through a very quantitative lens. If you can't measure it in a very clear quantitative way, then apparently it's not worth measuring, which we know is not a valid argument, but that is what's driven science, and it's what's driven funding, I think, is one of the fundamental issues here. Social science humanities departments are woefully underfunded compared to physical sciences. They have been for a very, very long time. We're starting to see a shift. We're starting to see an emergence of more behavioral science interacting with more natural sciences. But even then, as Claire noted, in the IPCC, which has become more holistic and integrated over the last few assessment reports, even there, we're still seeing a huge mismatch in the balance of these disciplines. And it's a real problem when it comes to identifying solutions to these largely behavioral problems. We are in this situation with sustainability or lack thereof because of our behavior, because of our patterns of consumption, because of our cultures collectively and individually. And until we can understand how to interact with people to help advise on choices or even inform about the impacts of these choices, until we know how to do that effectively, we really won't be any closer to solving these problems. We are seeing a shift to recognizing that this is important. It's a shame that it's come so late in the day, but I think there is a positive uptick now in the inclusion of humanities and social sciences. But we really have to, put our foot to the pedal to accelerate this much faster than is taking place at the moment.
Well, I'm very happy to see that I agree with all of you, and you all raised very important dimensions of the problem. I should also recall that my own institution, the International Science Council, is doing a big effort to integrate all the disciplines. You know that we are the result of the merger between the International Social Science Council and the International Council of Science. We decided to merge it to found a global voice for all sciences. And INGSA itself is a clear proof that we are trying hard to integrate all the disciplines. But it's not an easy way, we know, but it's good to know that there is growing consensus around this issue. And there is something else I would like to ask your views, and that concerns the assessment of impact, of science impact. Of course, when we talk about the relationship between science-based evidence and policy initiatives, we are talking about impact. But when we measure impact, usually academic institutions, funding agents, and scientists themselves usually rely on internal indicators only. What is taken into account are peer review, publications, reference, patents. I mean, things that are really crucial to assess the quality of science. But what other ways to measure science impact would be relevant in your view and feasible as well, so that we have a more accurate, a broader assessment of this impact of science? Do you think we should search to use other indications? How viable this is? Is it really worth trying? You are all
Happy to jump in first, maybe here. I mean, I think that when it comes to measuring impacts, certainly from my perspective, working in publishing, where we're very much integrated in the current system for measuring impact, I think the approach that we have now is a very outdated approach. I think historically, when it came to the impact of one's science, it essentially amounted to the recognition that you receive from your peer. Have you read my science? Yes, you have. Therefore, it must be impactful. This is when a very antiquated approach of knowledge really being restricted to an upper hierarchy of scientists, and it was knowledge for the sake of knowledge, which is fantastic to pursue knowledge and discovery and science. Amazing. But we know that the real value in science is through its application. And I think this is where we have a massive gap. At the moment, we're still measuring the value of science to your peers, to your colleagues, to other people who are already knowledgeable about that science. You have a paper, it gets cited again. We consider that to be impactful. We consider the journals that are publishing those papers to be cited by fellow scientists, to be impactful journals, which is the main platform for researchers to communicate their results. And yet, this isn't a true measure of how science can have an impact on these bigger issues. And we know that science-based approaches can make a big difference, assuming the science is robust and sound and valid. But measuring that impact is incredibly difficult. And I don't think anybody has an idea of really how to do that effectively. The current system of measuring the worth of science based on recognition from one's peer works quite well because it's a very contained framework and a very contained system. All researchers, they publish papers feed in to these very large citation databases. References are formatted in a very clear way, and they move into then these metrics of citations and impact. If we really want to understand or develop a system that measures the real impact of science, the impact of science on society or for society or with society, I feel we first need to determine what impact really is. Is impact of science a simple recognition of decision makers of that science, of that synthesis report, of that paper? Is that enough? Is that enough to measure the impact of science? So yes, so science broke through and has informed policy. Is that really sufficient? Or do we feel that impact is about science changing policy or being used to advise policy that has then made a positive difference? And how do we measure that? How do we measure the success of policy? How do we determine whether it's a positive success or a negative impact of policy change? I feel this is the problem at the moment when we look at measuring the impact of science. Now, the gatekeepers of measuring impact think about this in a very different way to how I believe it should be considered in the policy domain. And until we either come up with a completely new way of measuring impact or maybe a complementary approach that sits side by side the current approach, until we understand how we define impact, how we develop a system that feeds data back into a central resource, and then who manages that resource, who monitors that resource. It's a very large, complicated, and probably time-consuming and expensive endeavor, which very few, if any, people are really looking into. I think it's, again, quite a large oversight at the moment until we know how to come up with a process and a system that can measure that impact, we'll be having this conversation for decades.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So it's difficult to limit this into few words. I've been working actually on developing new indicators for research and the impact of research upon society now for more than I think half a decade. And it's true what Louis is saying here. There is a lot of challenges. But I also think that the only way we can answer the question of impact indicators has to go through a detour over the second question that you posed to us tonight, Elisa, namely the question about the availability of science advice to government, also from social sciences and humanities. And in order to provide that type of advice and to train scholars to really cultivate their ability to communicate to policymakers, it needs to be better incentivized and needs to be better rewarded. And the only way to do that is to systematically collect some data that is indicative of policy influence or policy uptake. So I think already in our conversation this afternoon, we actually do have a couple of ideas for how to then go ahead and start tracing and tracking the policy significance of research. I also believe what Louis said is right, that it's difficult to come up with measurement of final impacts. As I mentioned before, scientific knowledge and science advice is often only one component of a very complex decision-making process. And it's extremely difficult to map the scientific component onto the end result of a non-linear decision process. And that is what would be needed in order to come up with, let's say, a causal impact metric. So I think we should be developing something less ambitious, as it were, namely understanding in a more profound way the impact pathways to policy. So what are some of the major communicative routes being taken to influence policy? Yes, it is citations of academic literature in policy reports. This can be traced. It might also be memberships of policy commissions, government expert groups, task forces. It may also be, that you're having a policy briefing once in a while published, and that it's being getting the attention of policymakers. It's being mentioned somewhere that you can record. Or you may also go for some impact case studies in which you're interviewing basically policymakers about their awareness of research. So none of these indicators that I'm mentioning here are able to really document the final policy change that will take place at the end of the day, but they're able to document policy contributions. And I think that the contribution of researchers, scholars, scientists to policymaking is actually much more interesting and much more crucial than the final behavioral or organizational change that emerges after a very complex process. So I would argue that we should develop, and we have tried to do that in Copenhagen, new metrics simply that are able to trace some of these impact pathways, but again, driven by contribution analysis rather than attribution analysis.
Okay, thank you.
I love that last distinction that David made between the contribution and the attribution, because at one point in the assessment systems in the UK, when I was still in the civil service, I would get an email from a scientist saying, please, would you send me a letter saying that my paper influenced government policy in such and such a way, and bless them, because you wanted to encourage them and see that they were rewarded for having contributed, but it was just a meaningless question usually. I do think we need to acknowledge that there's an awful lot of plurality here. I mean, there are very different types of science and of humanities, and some of them are not going to show impact in any measurable way, possibly ever, and that's actually fine. And some maybe it'll be centuries and everything in between. And some sometimes actually with very kind of near-term work, it's actually just was this piece of research delivered on the timescale that it was going to be in a way that was communicated well and expressed well and so on. But so there's a kind of multiple different sorts of ways in which to assess or consider impact. I mean, I think that the kind of some of the new shoots and ways of thinking about considering impact will also come from some of the very thoughtful case studies that you begin to see being done. I'm conscious, for example, there was some work by a body called the Institute for Government in the UK. It's now a little old, but it looked where there had been a significant policy change in the UK on 6 issues. One of them was the introduction of statutory carbon budgets, which was quite a big, a big step. The creation of a national minimum wage, and it looked back over the preceding, usually 2 to 4 decades, about what evolution of both the politics and the evidence seemed to have contributed to a very significant shift where something that might have been unimaginable at one point became capable of being put into law. A complete smoking ban in public spaces was another of these. That was it was done purely by interviews and relatively rapidly, but that began to tease out something about where and how concerted efforts by scientists and scholars had contributed to that kind of policy change. And of course, sometimes the same people doing the same thing can make a big difference because the window of opportunity in the policy world is open, and sometimes it doesn't. And that's not a fault of the scientists, as it were. So I think there are going to be lots of different ways. I'd put a shout out also though for relationship building. I mean, there's a little bit here of you kind of know that researchers are being effective if also they're constantly being asked back. I mean, it's as I say, there are many other measures, many different measures, but by and large, if you're seeing in a policy area that's a really good networks, longer term relationships building, where there's a kind of creation of understanding about the policy landscape on the one side and from the researchers, and maybe of what the kind of methodologies and possibilities are from the point of view of the policymakers. They're learning the language of the scholars, then that's usually a sign that things are working perhaps better than they have been, and the impact is beginning to happen. But that's a very qualitative measure, and as Louis said, it's not straightforward, but we've all got to work at it.
If I may add to that, I think that is very true, Claire. I think that's relationship building and the ability also to keep track of that, even though it is output data or activity data, is still very much important because it's indicative of the interest and the potential uptake of research, while it may not be indicative of the final uptake. It indicates you where you would go look, for example, in a case study. So I would definitely keep track of that. But I would also remind ourselves and the audience of a small anecdote that came from Sir Peter Glückman, the president of INGSA, who said that a lot of the real policy impact of science is often invisible because it's about avoiding bad decisions. So when you're called upon by a minister really to provide impactful advice, and you're advising the minister not to make a bad decision, this obviously will never be recorded, and you will never be able to evidence it. And probably the minister will never be in a position to admit or acknowledge that impact. So it is in the nature of policy impact and in the nature of science advice, such as the advice that INGSA is championing, that it is difficult to measure. And I also take with me from this session, as Claire and Louis said, that different policy domains do tend to have different epistemic cultures. What is the standard knowledge uptake and scientific advice mechanisms in health or energy or climate change might not easily be replicated within the Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Education, or Ministry of Justice. So we do have to acknowledge that. And instead of coming up with universal metrics, perhaps better understanding the ecosystem in which we as scholars can contribute to policymaking.
if I could just kind of add a final note on relationships as well, I think the level of expectation of different stakeholders needs some attention. I find that increasingly a researcher is being asked to, pitch an idea for a project, to obtain funding for that project, to plan that project, to execute the research, to synthesize that work, to write it into an impactful, engaging, communicative article, then to translate that further so it can be widely understood by society, and then to potentially even go in and advise decision makers. This is a big ask for someone who probably has not been trained in 70% of those expectations. And going back to incentives, what is the incentive for that individual? Some individuals, particularly in the areas of climate change, sustainability, take it upon themselves to advocate and even participate in activism because they recognize the need and the desperation of the issue. But others, for them, the incentive is to publish a paper and to then move on to the next. And this is where I feel this issue of synthesis comes in. Independent bodies to do this, whose role it is to look at that science, to synthesize that science, who are specially trained in informing decision makers of the pros, of the cons, of the caveats, of the societal implications. At the moment, I feel a great weight is being placed upon the researcher. In some countries, no, but in others where you don't have these independent groups or bodies that advise the government, it's a big ask for a person to do all of these things.
Okay, I really have to thank you all for your very enlightening comments. I really benefit from them, and I'm sure the audience too. And I can see that somehow we share opinions. There is a lot of consensus between the four of us. And that brings me to an optimist thought. I mean, I was reflecting upon this part of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, where they state that everybody has a right to science, one of the most forgotten aspects of the chart. And I think, in a way, this sort of dialogue we are having now and the things we pointed out somehow are pointing out the progress that we have made to make this right to science available to more and more people. With that, I really renew my thanks to all of you. And if you have anything to add, we still have maybe 3 minutes. Feel free.
Can I just add another of the more upbeat notes? Because I mean, it can be incredibly difficult, clearly, and Lewis was highlighting some of the reasons why it's incredibly difficult for scientists and human scholars to get involved. But also, for many a time, you just see the intellectual satisfaction of bringing your work into new contexts, and quite often also people go away from engagement with policy world with questions that then they find bring them into new avenues. So it can be really exciting and enjoyable, kind of whether or not you get the impact score, that it can be simply a stimulating thing to be involved in as well. Just wanted to add that to the upbeat note.
Yes, thank you. Okay, that's it. If that's it, I renew my thanks. I hope we have other opportunities to engage in this lively subject, and I hope we go on making progress. Bye now.
The word impact came up several times during the discussion, and I think we can say it was an impactful panel. Many thanks to our moderator and speakers, and also to Elsevier for making this panel possible. We will be back after a 45 minutes lunch break. See you soon.